The lights weren't supposed to turn out like this. In theaters across continents, something unusual was happening, an energy that didn't feel like a typical opening weekend, didn't feel like nostalgia, didn't feel like routine box office reporting. It felt bigger, heavier, almost like history was being rewritten in real time. Because according to early industry reports circulating through entertainment insiders and distribution analysts, the Michael Jackson biopic, long whispered about, debated, delayed, and doubted, was not just performing well. It was exploding. Not slowly, not gradually, but in a way that sent shockwaves through Hollywood accounting offices and streaming boardrooms within hours of release. Numbers climbing faster than projections. Midnight screenings selling out in cities where analysts predicted modest turnout. International markets, especially across parts of Africa, reporting attendance levels that no one in the industry fully anticipated. And then came the phrase that set social media on fire. Africa is driving this record-breaking wave. But what does that even mean in the context of a global icon like Michael Jackson? And why are some executives privately calling this moment a cultural correction, while others are warning it could reshape the entire economics of music biopics forever? Because behind the celebration, behind the headlines, behind the viral clips flooding TikTok and YouTube, there is something else forming in the shadows of this success. A question nobody seems fully ready to answer. Is this purely a film success story, or something far more emotionally and culturally charged? And if this momentum continues, who actually benefits? And who might lose control of the narrative? The answers begin far earlier than the opening weekend. Before the premiere lights. Before the red carpets. Before the viral standing ovations. They begin with a name the world has never stopped arguing about. Michael Jackson. Even decades after his death, Jackson remains one of the most polarizing figures in entertainment history. To millions, he is the king of pop, an artist whose influence shaped modern music, dance, and global pop culture itself. To others, his legacy is complicated, layered with controversy, legal scrutiny, and unresolved public debate that still sparks division across generations. And that is exactly why this biopic was never going to be just another movie. Because telling his story means stepping directly into a cultural battlefield that never cooled down. Sources close to production, speaking carefully, often without confirmation, have long suggested that the film wasn't just designed as entertainment. It was positioned as a global event. A cinematic attempt to reinterpret a life that has been documented, mythologized, and dissected more than almost any other artist in modern history. But even they didn't predict this level of reaction. The first signs came quietly. Advanced screenings in select international markets. Early audience reactions describing something emotionally overwhelming. Critics using phrases like viscerally immersive and unexpectedly human. But buried inside those early reviews was something more revealing. Audiences weren't just watching Michael Jackson. They were reacting to him. As if the film wasn't simply portraying a legacy, but reopening a conversation the world never truly finished. And that's when the box office numbers began to shift. At first, analysts assumed a regional spike. Then a pattern emerged that no one could ignore. Strong turnout in parts of Europe. Unexpected surges in Latin America. And most notably, extraordinary engagement across multiple African markets, where cinema chains reported sold-out screenings and repeated demand that exceeded supply projections. One distribution executive, speaking anonymously, described it as a global imbalance we didn't model for. But why Africa? Why now? Some cultural analysts suggest the answer lies in generational memory. Michael Jackson's global tours in Africa during his lifetime left behind a powerful imprint, one that blended music, performance, and emotional connection in a way few Western artists had achieved at that scale. Others argue something more modern is at play. A digital generation rediscovery. A TikTok-fueled resurgence. A wave of younger audiences encountering Jackson not through controversy, but through music, choreography, and archival performances that feel almost unreal in today's algorithm-driven entertainment landscape. But beneath those explanations, another tension is forming. Because as the film's success grows, so does the debate over what exactly is being celebrated, and whether a biopic can ever truly separate the artist from the argument. By its second day, social media had already split into distinct emotional camps. One side posting emotional reactions, fans crying in theaters, describing the film as a tribute done right, calling it a long-overdue global acknowledgement of Jackson's cultural impact. The other side raising concerns, questioning narrative framing, historical accuracy, and whether the film responsibly handles the most sensitive chapters of his life. And in the middle, a massive audience simply overwhelmed by the scale of it all. Clips began circulating of packed cinemas reacting in real time. Applause during performance recreations. Silence during emotional sequences. Entire audiences standing as credits rolled, not as a gimmick, but as if they had just witnessed something personal. And that's when the industry realized something important. This wasn't behaving like a standard biopic. IT was behaving like an event. Like a global referendum on memory itself. Inside Hollywood, executives began recalculating expectations in real time. One studio consultant described the internal mood shift as controlled panic mixed with disbelief. Because if the early numbers held, this wasn't just a hit. It was a category disruptor. Music biopics have historically followed predictable patterns: nostalgia-driven openings, moderate international performance, and sharp declines after initial curiosity fades. But this trajectory was different. Sustained demand, cross-generational engagement, and an unusually strong international backbone that wasn't reliant solely on North American performance. And then came the African markets. Reports indicated that in multiple major cities, screenings weren't just selling out, they were expanding. Additional showtimes added midweek. Smaller venues upgrading capacity. Some theaters reportedly organizing back-to-back screenings due to overwhelming demand. In industry terms, this kind of pattern is rare. In cultural terms, it's even rarer. And in emotional terms, it signals something even more complex. A global audience reclaiming a shared memory. But not everyone agrees on what that memory means. Media analysts have begun pointing out a growing divide in coverage. Some outlets frame the success as a triumph of legacy and artistry. Others emphasize controversy, questioning whether the film is contributing to historical revisionism or simply reflecting audience demand. Legal and business analysts are watching even more closely. Because when a film tied to a figure as globally recognized as Michael Jackson performs at this scale, it doesn't just impact box office charts. It affects music catalogs, licensing agreements, estate valuations, streaming behavior, even merchandising markets tied to decades-old intellectual property. One entertainment lawyer summarized it bluntly. When Michael Jackson moves culturally, the entire entertainment economy feels it. But behind all of this analysis, something quieter is happening online. Something less structured, more emotional. Fans are not debating numbers. They're debating meaning. On TikTok, users post clips of emotional reactions inside theaters, people covering their faces during performances, others applauding as if attending a live concert rather than a film. On YouTube, commentary channels break down scenes frame by frame, arguing over accuracy, symbolism, and artistic intent. On X, the discourse is sharper, divided between celebration and criticism, admiration and skepticism. And underneath it all is a recurring question that no algorithm seems able to resolve. What do we do with a legacy this large? The emotional center of the film, according to early viewers, does not rely on spectacle alone. It leans heavily into vulnerability, moments portraying isolation, pressure, fame's psychological weight, and the suffocating expectations that define Jackson's public life. And that's where the audience reaction becomes most complicated, because it forces viewers to confront not just the myth of Michael Jackson, but the human being behind it. A human being the world has never unanimously agreed on how to remember. And that tension is what keeps conversations alive long after the credits roll. Industry observers are already predicting the next phase of fallout. If momentum continues, award season positioning becomes inevitable. International distribution deals will expand. Streaming platforms will compete aggressively for post-theatrical rights, and the estate management surrounding Jackson's legacy could see renewed global attention at a scale not seen in years. But there is another possibility being discussed quietly in industry circles: that this film may not just succeed commercially. It may redefine how global audiences engage with contested cultural figures altogether, and that raises a more uncomfortable question. If a biopic can generate this level of emotional unity in some regions and emotional division in others, what does that say about the stories we choose to tell and the versions of truth we are willing to accept? As the weekend closes, one image continues to circulate more than any other: a packed cinema. Audience members standing in silence as the final scene fades out. No cheering. No rushing for exits. Just stillness. As if no one is entirely sure what they have just experienced, or what it means for the memory of an artist who never really left the world stage. And perhaps that is the real story unfolding here. Not just record-breaking numbers. Not just regional surges. Not just industry disruption. But a global audience, once again, trying to reconcile emotion with history, admiration with controversy, and nostalgia with truth. And in that space between celebration and conflict, one question lingers longer than anything else. When a legend's story is retold at this scale, who truly owns the ending? If you've watched the reactions, the debates, or felt even a fraction of what this moment represents, the conversation doesn't end here. Because something tells us this is only the beginning. The moment the weekend numbers solidified, the story stopped being just about a film. It became about power, about memory, about who gets to define legacy when the person at the center of that legacy is no longer here to respond. And almost immediately, the tone shifted. What had begun as celebration in theaters across the world began transforming into something far more complicated in the public sphere, especially online, where emotion doesn't stay contained for long. Because once the box office headlines hit mainstream feeds, a second wave began forming underneath it. Not applause, not criticism, but collision. Across platforms, the conversation around Michael Jackson began to fracture into competing realities. One version of events framed the biopic as long overdue recognition of global influence, a restoration of artistry, performance, and cultural dominance that transcended decades and geography. Another version argued something more uncomfortable: that no matter how beautifully crafted the film might be, revisiting such a deeply controversial figure through a celebratory cinematic lens would inevitably reopen unresolved ethical debates the world never fully settled. And in that tension, the internet did what it always does best. It amplified everything. Within hours, clips from theaters were being stripped of context and reposted with radically different interpretations depending on the uploader's perspective. A standing ovation in one video became proof of cultural vindication in one caption and emotional manipulation in another. The same moment. Two completely opposing meanings. And the algorithm didn't care which was true. It only cared that people kept watching. But inside the industry, the reaction wasn't ideological first. It was financial. Because the second-week projections were not behaving like a typical blockbuster curve. They were bending. Instead of the usual steep drop after opening weekend, international markets, particularly in parts of Africa, were reporting sustained demand. Not curiosity spikes. Not one-time turnout, but repeat attendance patterns in certain urban centers, with theaters adding additional screenings in response to unexpected sellouts. One distribution executive described it as a cultural echo effect, where audiences weren't just seeing the film once. They were returning to it, sometimes for the music, sometimes for the performance recreations. Sometimes, according to theater staff interviews, simply to experience the emotional atmosphere inside the auditorium again. But that kind of behavior creates a problem for analysts, because it breaks the usual predictive models. And when models break, industries start asking questions they don't normally want to confront. What is driving this? The story? The nostalgia? or something deeper in the global cultural psyche? And that question led directly into the next phase of the narrative war. Media outlets began shifting their framing. Some headlines focused on the historic global reception, emphasizing the unprecedented international turnout and calling it one of the most culturally resonant music biopics in recent memory. Others took a more cautious tone, highlighting unresolved debates around Jackson's legacy and warning that commercial success does not equate to historical consensus. And that split mattered. Because once media framing divides, audience interpretation follows. On one side, fan communities began building what could only be described as digital archives of admiration, compiling performance clips, historical footage, and personal testimonials about how Jackson's music shaped their lives across decades and continents. On the other side, commentary channels and cultural critics began dissecting the film's narrative choices frame by frame, asking what was included, what was omitted, and what emotional cues were being used to guide audience sympathy. And somewhere between those two extremes, the average viewer was left in an increasingly uncomfortable position. Not sure what they were supposed to feel, only sure that they felt something. But the most intense shift was happening not in reviews, not in headlines, and not even in box office charts. It was happening in emotional language itself. Because people weren't just saying I liked it or I didn't like it. They were saying things like, I didn't expect to cry like that. I felt like I was watching history and heartbreak at the same time. I don't know how to separate the music from everything else anymore. That last sentence, in particular, began circulating widely, because it captured the core conflict of the entire moment. Separation, or the inability to do it. Inside Hollywood strategy rooms, executives began watching this emotional data as closely as revenue data. Not just how many tickets were sold, but why people were buying them. And more importantly, what they were doing afterward. Search trends revealed a surge in archival content consumption, old performances resurfacing, interviews being rewatched, documentary clips trending again after years of dormancy, streaming platforms quietly noting increased activity around Jackson-related catalogs. It wasn't just a film anymore. It was a reactivation of an entire cultural ecosystem. But with reactivation comes pressure. And pressure attracts conflict. Legal analysts began discussing a subtle but significant consequence of this renewed attention: estate visibility. When a legacy-driven project performs at global scale, it inevitably strengthens the commercial ecosystem around that legacy. Licensing, catalog streaming, brand partnerships, and rights management all become more valuable and more scrutinized. One analyst described it as a second life of intellectual property value. But even that phrase felt too clean for what was actually unfolding. Because what was really happening was emotional as much as financial. Families watching together across generations. Older audiences recalling where they were when Jackson's music first dominated global radio. Younger audiences encountering a version of him shaped not by controversy first, but by performance, artistry, and cinematic reconstruction. And those two experiences don't always align neatly. In fact, they rarely do. That generational gap began to surface in comment sections everywhere. Older viewers often spoke in terms of memory, what they lived through, what they witnessed, what his music meant in real time. Younger viewers often spoke in terms of discovery, what they were seeing for the first time, what they were learning through the film, what surprised them about the scale of his influence. And when those two perspectives collided, the tone of discussion shifted again, from admiration to negotiation. What is remembered? What is taught? What is emphasized? And who gets to decide? Meanwhile, in theaters still running packed screenings, something quieter continued to happen. Audience behavior began taking on a ritualistic quality. People arriving early, sitting through credits in silence, not rushing out immediately afterward. Some reportedly staying seated long after the screen went dark, as if processing something that didn't end when the story ended. One theater employee described it simply: "It doesn't feel like a movie night. It feels like people are leaving something behind." And that description began circulating online, gaining traction not because it was dramatic, but because it felt accurate. But the emotional intensity of the moment also created friction. Because with every wave of admiration came an equal wave of discomfort from those who felt the film's success risked simplifying a deeply complex legacy into something too emotionally unified, too commercially clean, too narratively controlled. And that tension is where the next conflict begins to form. Not in theaters, not in reviews, but in what happens next. Because success at this scale always invites replication. Studios begin asking, can this be repeated? Can other global icons receive similar treatment? Can controversial legacies be turned into cinematic events that transcend geography the way this one appears to be doing? And if the answer is yes, what does that mean for the future of storytelling? But if the answer is no, then what exactly made this moment different? As the second wave of box office data begins to settle, one thing becomes increasingly clear. This is no longer just about one film's performance. It is about a global audience renegotiating its relationship with fame, memory, and cultural history in real time. And somewhere inside that negotiation, an uncomfortable truth continues to surface. Stories don't just reflect legacy. They reshape it. And once reshaping begins at this scale, it rarely moves in only one direction. The question now is not whether the film will succeed. It already has. The question is what kind of meaning will survive after the applause fades, and whether the world is truly ready for that answer.